On December 4th, 2020, the Council for Quality Growth hosted its 35th annual meeting, presented by Georgia Power. Guests in person and virtual alike took a look back at the Council's work in the year, thanked the 2020 Chairman Paul Corley, elected its Board of Directors for the upcoming year, and welcomed 2021 Chairman Doug Jenkins. The highlight of the event was a keynote presented virtually by urbanist Greg Lindsay, live from his home in Montreal.
So now I have the pleasure of introducing our keynote for today, Greg Lindsay. Greg is Director of Applied Research with NewCities and Director of Strategy at its mobility offshoot, CoMotion. Greg is the co-author of a critically acclaimed international bestseller, a lot of you familiar with this, the book Aerotropolis, The Way We Will Live Next. He's a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Foresight Strategy and Risk Initiative, a senior fellow of MIT's Future Urban Collectives Lab, and a visiting scholar at New York University's Rudin Center for Transportation Policy and Management. He's advised several major companies you might have heard of, Intel, Samsung, Starbucks, just to name a few. And as you may also have remember him and caught his TV appearances, this is really good, as a two-time Jeopardy champion, and the only human to go undefeated against IBM's Watson. I was going to do that, but he beat me to it. So he wanted to be here in person today, but Greg is coming to us from Canada due to international travel restrictions. He would have had to go back and quarantine by himself for 2 weeks. So he's here live from his home in Ontario. Greg, there he is right there. Greg, it's good to see you today. Greg is going to share with us what he's seeing trending in urban life as we navigate this pandemic. If you're online, if you have questions for Greg at the end, please put them in the chat box, and here in person, we'll go from table to table if you have questions. So please welcome Greg Lindsay.
Thank you so much, Michael. It's a pleasure joining you. Apologies for any lag in the Zoom. That's how this virtual world works. I would have loved to have joined you all in person today, but unfortunately my wife went back to I'm here in Montreal in Canada, and my wife went back to the States to see her family for Thanksgiving. So we don't know who would drive the children to school if we were both stuck in quarantine for the next 2 weeks. So that's how life is going in here. But I want to get into it here. I'm going to shrink myself down and bring my slides up. I've got a fun presentation for you here on thoughts on sort of what we can look ahead to in 2021 and sort of obviously sort of the ongoing effects and what it means for urbanism and sustainable quality growth going into 2021. So, obviously we're coming to the end of the tunnel, as you know, with the vaccines coming. And I think about all the time, I've been thinking about the trade-offs that we've been making. I've been thinking a lot about the Robert Frost poem, Fire and Ice. This has been my mantra for 2020, frankly. Some say the world will end in fire. This, of course, referring to climate change. Just this past week at NewCities, we hosted our first event on climate migration, looking at, frankly, the people who will move away from coasts and other high-risk areas to places like Atlanta. Atlanta, of course, is the main destination of people who left New Orleans after Katrina. So we were thinking about what happens, if we continue our unsustainable growth patterns. And then, of course, this year we've also seen what happens if we freeze the world. Some say the world will end in ice. I'll show some slides in a moment here, but the unprecedented economic lockdowns and the damage that we had to do to our economy in the beginning of the pandemic and continuing through, of course, has had incredible repercussions as well. But I suspect and I believe among many that, from what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who favor fire. I think 2021 is going to be a boom year. I think we're going to see all this incredible pent up demand for experiences, for travel, to be with our loved ones again. And that makes me worry as well. I worry that we will resume our previously unsustainable growth patterns without having put thought into how we can improve upon them and absorb the lessons of this unprecedented year. So just as a bit of background here, and thinking about some of the trends that we've seen and how this can inform how we go forward in 2021, the remainder of this decade. There was a paper that came out in Nature this spring showing that in April, the heart of the lockdowns, global carbon emissions dropped 17%. That was the good news. The bad news is we had to basically destroy temporarily 40% of the global economy to do it, which I think is also interesting because it shows that even if we do almost the utmost minimum to move through the world, to simply hide in our homes, we still can't actually unwind the carbon emissions that dominate most of our world. So we need to rethink our larger patterns of movement and how and where we work and how we will continue going forward once we're back outside of our homes again in force. And this is from the Nature paper here. To me, what's interesting, you can see these sort of graphs here about the various ways you can contribute to carbon emissions. But the biggest one was surface transportation. It was the fact that we were no longer commuting to work, that we had changed our daily patterns that had led to the biggest drop in this. And I thought about that graph, and I thought about graphed against this one, which is from the International Energy Agency, which shows that the simple conversion over the last decade from people driving cars to driving SUVs and light trucks, which I think are now like 75% of US auto sales, that alone contributed to the second largest increase in carbon emissions over the last decade, more than aviation, more than heavy industry, I think only behind power generation. So it'll be very interesting to see as we basically pursue clean technologies, we see wind and solar and these advancements over the next decade, how that could change. But we've also seen the effects of ice, of freezing our economy, and the incredible energies that have been unleashed during the pandemic when it comes to delivery, when it comes to how we consume media and entertainment at home. This is a pre-pandemic graph that shows basically the effects of e-commerce on our cities over the last 30 years. You could see that, well before the pandemic, that Amazon and others had eaten heavily into, old forms of retailing, newsstands, bookstores, hardware stores, but they'd been made up for by all the growth in face-to-face dining and personal services, nail salons, pet cares, restaurants, all the things, of course, that we couldn't do during the heart of the pandemic. And so I worry about, the fact that we now see in survey data coming from McKinsey and others, this is one of their most recent reports that came out this week here, about the changes in behaviors, about the acceleration in e-commerce, and what that could do to our traditional real estate formulas and how we live in cities. The latest piece of news, for example, is Warner Brothers announcing that their entire 2021 slate would appear on HBO Max at the same time as being in theaters. We're now seeing discussion about whether the movie theater as we know it could die in this decade. That would be the biggest change to that since the 1940s, since the arrival of television. That's the kind of epochal shift that we're sort of facing here. And you can see that many of these behaviors are changing how we approach retail and changing, sort of many of these behaviors will stick, some will leave behind during the pandemic, but a lot of the stuff is changing the formulas that have driven our real estate investments until now and pushing us towards interesting new mixed use categories, which I'll talk about in just a few minutes. And then, of course, there's the effects of technology coming down the pike as well. I won't get into autonomous vehicles too much here, but there's been some discussion about whether all of these new technologies which are coming. We now have robo-taxis for hire in places like Phoenix that are now actually being tested without safety drivers on roads in California. They're now being tested in China as well. These are the technologies that will also perhaps come to define this decade, and they will have huge repercussions on land use and real estate. I participate in many a debate about whether these energies will be centripetal or centrifugal. Will, this profusion of new delivery services, whatnot, pull people back into cities once we have a vaccine, where, they're basically, you can get same hour delivery instead of same day, for example, or will they push people back out deeper and deeper into suburbia and exurbia, or into the rural areas, of course, where, we can have large homes that deliver everything to us in terms of media. This is a debate that was happening before 2020, and now it's been like gasoline poured on a fire, so to speak. So you can see this debate play out almost week by week in the various reports by Redfin and Zillow, for example. I've been enjoying watching their CEOs duel over what will be our future. And Redfin, of course, is all in on the notion that, the combination of widespread work from home, work from anywhere, which I'll talk about, coupled with, of course, the low interest rates that are fueling record home sales and record low inventories, will lead to this big suburban boom. While Zillow has, pumped the brakes on this, saying that even their search data, while they see that everyone is reevaluating their life choices, they don't see people fleeing density as we know it for, a cottage in the countryside. But what we are seeing, and this seems to be, again, an acceleration of a previous trend, is seeing people leave America's high-cost coastal metros. The two cities we can say for certain that, or the two areas at least where people are leaving in droves is Manhattan and, of course, San Francisco, where, of course, the trade-offs of quality of life or accessibility to work has been completely upended by the pandemic and work from home. And they're headed to places, of course, like Atlanta. I spent much of last year and some of this year writing a whole report on where the millennial generation would go to raise their kids as they turn 40 and enter their peak childbearing years. And the answer is what you already know, of course. They would go to the large Sunbelt metros of the United States where they can have it all. They can have a mix of urban amenities if they choose, but have that higher quality of life and that larger home if they want it. Redfin, in an epic bit of trolling, just published a report yesterday, as it turns out, where they basically argue that, the folks who have headed to Atlanta in the last year, 50,000 arrivals, well, 50,000 arrivals from out of state into Georgia, mostly concentrated in the Atlanta suburbs, Well, of those 50,000, more than a third of those came from New York, which is a very interesting statistic to think about. That's about 17,000 people, and the margin of President-elect Biden's victory was about 13,000 votes. So I'm waiting for Andrew Cuomo and his disastrous response to COVID so far to take credit for the victory there. We could soon see, states like California and New York start to take credit for their terrible housing policies, their failure to provide attainable housing to their citizens, causing them to leave for places like Colorado, Arizona, and of course, Georgia and Atlanta. So this is, of course, all part of the K-shaped recovery. If this is the letter that stands out in my mind for this year about what we've seen, of course, which is the incredible uneven recession we've had. For the people at the top of the so-called K, right, the notion of a divergent economy, it's not even a recession at all. It's been a time of record asset appreciation and, of course, as I mentioned, home sales. And I think this is going to be, driving growth going forward. What kind of new models of development will we have for the people who are staying in cities and who are buying these new homes? Now, I, like many others, have looked actually across the Atlantic to Paris. This is the home, you may have heard of, the so-called 15-minute city. We at NewCities are going to be teaching a master class on this in the new year, led by Paris Mayor Anne Hidalgo and Carlos Marino, her advisor, who's cooked up this idea. And of course, the notion of a 15-minute city is a city where you can live your life in a 15-minute radius of a walk or bicycle ride, if you're in central Paris, perhaps drive, if you're the rest of us, away from your home. And of course, this was impossible before, right? We commuted every day, and those commutes on average started at 20 minutes and went up from there in the United States. But it's the idea that work from home, coupled with the notion that, that we should basically build more amenities in place, that we should live more local lives, is something that's really caught the imagination of the world. And as you can see in these renderings here from Paris, this the idea that you would repurpose street space from cars, and you would build new mixed uses. You would create more hybrid cities where activity would spill out of storefronts onto the streets, playgrounds and seating and parking. And that's a lot of sort of what we've seen across the United States and across Atlanta during, of course, the pandemic, the need to create outdoor space for social distancing to help our restaurants and retail industries. This is an image, of course, from New York this past summer, where Mayor Bill de Blasio, in one of the better moves of his mayoralty, has basically made outdoor dining permanent. And now we're seeing businesses are actually sort of building, structures in the streets of New York, leading that kind of indoor-outdoor life. And I think this will be remembered as an incredible giveaway for the businesses that do survive in New York, to really sort of have this foothold in the urban realm, which will allow them to attract even more foot traffic going forward. And I should note, you can see the sort of scooter there, obviously in the foreground. We've seen, of course, also the rise of micromobility. I think it's interesting that there in Peachtree Corners, of course, you have some of the world's first autonomous scooters. I think we need a name for these beings that are going to wander the world. I like to think of them as a scrum of scooters, which also works well when they're piled up in a garbage can by somebody who ditched them there. But these scooters by Tortoise, I think, points to one of the things that we're going to see over the remainder of this decade, right? We're going to see new forms of mobility that can basically park themselves as needed, where you can step outside and you might be able to hop a scooter or whatever evolves from them going forward. We're going to have a profusion of devices that are somewhere that are heavier than a bicycle and lighter than a car that may carry us forward from there. And other cities around the world have been even more aggressive in rethinking their streets and their transportation on the other side of the pandemic. Bogota, Colombia, has been one of the world leaders in this. This is Mayor Claudia Lopez, where she's vowed that she wants 50% of all trips in the city going forward to be done by bicycle. That's more than Copenhagen, more than Amsterdam. And it's a very canny political move on her part because, Bogota's failed to build a subway system and its bus system is sort of collapsing. So it's the notion of do it yourself. But we've seen, across the United States, we've seen cities take matters in their own hands over the last decade and invest in transit. And one of the things on election day that made me sad was seeing the Gwinnett referendum fail on transport. I covered the T-Splost referendum, I think 7 years ago now. And, we've seen Sunbelt cities, we've seen Atlanta's peers have invested in these kinds of referendums and asked their voters to provide for it. Austin, Texas, voters there spending $7 billion to expand their transit system. We've seen Charlotte now is stepping forward saying that they want to have another referendum in 2021 to expand their system again. I do think that we're going to see people want to continue these sustainable modes. And it's really interesting to me that, even in our time of incredibly divisive politics, we've seen at the local level, leaders step up and pass these measures, which are essential to quality of life. And so I think it's obviously essential they work with groups like yours to continue these more sustainable growth patterns that will allow us to, not depend entirely on cars, but couple it with other modes and allow these patterns. Because of course, when you do this, it unlocks the urban realm, right? We can put so much of Metro Atlanta and our cities to higher use. And just as an example of this, I worked on a project a few years ago with the architects of Woods Bagot, an Australian firm, which developed a tool that examined the parking lots of Los Angeles. So you're looking at downtown LA, these are just the city-owned parking lots, and they built a tool that allowed us to imagine, what if you built in them? What if you could change the zoning and change the FAR to build in more homes? And so, I went hog wild in this rendering, and you can see I added 50,000 homes to downtown LA and 85,000 people in just the surface parking lots. And their architects imagine, fanciful things like imagining new courtyard apartments if you got rid of parking minimums, imagining what you could do for dense urban infill, thinking about the new mixed use formulas on the other side. But back here in the real world, we've seen interesting policies get pushed forth during the pandemic over the summer. Portland followed in the wake of Minneapolis and basically allowed a change of zoning that would allow you to basically go from single family homes to duplexes, triplexes, and even fourplexes, what's so-called missing middle housing across the United States, or gentle density, as Brookings has called it. This, of course, I think is essential to fulfilling our goals of more attainable housing, to basically deregulate the market somewhat to allow developers to provide this and allow people to build it. And I think, of course, that would contribute to neighborhood foot traffic and drive things forward. And, again, one of the things I think we're going to see over the next decade, and this is work that we've been doing at NewCities as well with our housing initiatives, is we're going to see a whole new, native technology developer enabled stack emerge that will allow basically new companies to drive down the cost of development. So just this past week, I had a phone call with Fed and Peter Fedikov. They are the creators of Apt, the play on apartment. They were the ones running Airbnb's secret backyard skunkworks, thinking about new types of housing we could build in literally our backyards. And now they're actually coming up with a sort of combination of standardized housing type, using technology to drive the process. And it's going to be these kinds of startups, Apt and Juno and others. This is Cul-de-sac in Arizona. Here they've gone into Tempe, Arizona, and they've eliminated all the parking on site, and they're going to build 1,000 units of multifamily housing aimed, of course, at the young people who attend nearby Arizona State University. But we're going to see these new models emerge here where taking out the parking, changing up the formulas, investing in mixed use and amenities. And I think that's going to be one of the big formulas for growth, particularly for Gen Z, as they fill that niche that millennials once held of people who are investing in the urban realm and choosing with their feet to live there. Now, what about work? I'm going to come back to the notion quickly about remote work and what that means. Because, of course, this is the world we lived in before the pandemic. This is the Facebook newsfeed team and Frank Gehry's epic hangar of an office here, the world's ultimate open plan office. And I always think of this poor guy here, the one malcontent in the midst of this. I think it's how most of us felt in these open plan offices. But I also worry that this notion that we're going to work from home forever. And I wonder, sort of who's driving that narrative. When we see bank CEOs and tech CEOs saying that no one's ever going to go back to the office again, I just can't help but think that really what they want us to do is to absorb their real estate costs. But I think there's a middle path for it. And this is something that I've been thinking about for nearly a decade since I started studying the rise of co-working and remote work, which is the notion of, why did we go to the same place 5 days a week, every week, no matter what tasks we had or no matter what work needed doing? We had the technology before that. We just saw, for example, Salesforce just bought Slack for $27 billion, adding to their productivity tools. We've built all of these workflows, teams. We had to use them all. Zoom, here we are right now. And we've invested in this. And I think we're going to see an interesting comeback in the various companies that are providing these mixed-use workplaces as well. So WeWork, which we left for dead, of course, on the eve of the pandemic, is now rebounding a bit and now saying that their biggest customers are going to be corporations, enterprises that are ditching their own office portfolios and choosing to invest in these portfolios as well. And, I think one of the things we're going to see going forward, and this is what's going to be the legacy of the pandemic, is we're going to see increasingly mixed up uses, right? The silos that we understand real estate, of housing, multifamily and single family, of office, of retail, of these various silos here are all going to get scrambled. We've already seen, for example, this is Westfield's flagship mall on Market Street in San Francisco. Years ago, they tore out the anchor store and put in a co-working space because that drove the foot traffic. We've seen in the suburbs of Boston the same, going into big box stores and dropping in offices so you didn't have to commute from the suburbs of Boston. You could simply drive to the nearest Staples. We could easily start to see that in our places that would allow us to get out of our homes and away from having to do everything in our lives in the same space, but doing so in a way that's much closer to home with a much reduced commute time. And we're going to start converting some of these assets into other things as well. The smartest thing that Eddie Lampert ever did, as he was busy bankrupting both Sears and Kmart, was hiving off the most desirable locations in the portfolio into his own company so he could basically repurpose them into technology offices, in this case here in Santa Monica. And of course, we're going to need to do something with all these malls because, again, the pandemic has accelerated a trend that was well in the making, right? The mall apocalypse, the retail apocalypse. It was interesting. Before the pandemic, there was the widely cited Credit Suisse study that I think that said that a quarter of all U.S. malls would die between 2017 and 2022. At this point, we'll be lucky if there's a quarter of U.S. malls left. My friend Will McIntosh at USA Realco, the head economist there, likes to say that America retail isn't overbuilt; it's under demolished, and we may soon come see that come to pass. UBS here predicting 75,000 stores to close by 2026. Well, they're predicting 25,000 might close this year. So what are we going to do with all that real estate? That to me is one of the great challenges, right? Our challenge for the next year to 2 years is not what to build, but what to repurpose, what to rebuild. And we've seen a number of technology companies start to swoop in here, realizing these are undervalued assets that they can arbitrage, just as they arbitraged car ownership, for example. Cloud Kitchens, a startup that's basically owned by Travis Kalanick, founder of Uber, that's going into dead malls and other underutilized locations to basically open, a new type of infrastructure for small business owners who want to basically do restaurant deliveries through the major platforms. Reef Technology, based in Atlanta, they've raised now $2 billion in SoftBank money to start taking their portfolio of parking lots and repurpose it into other buildings. I've had conversations with them, and they have examples as interesting as urban agriculture to actually thinking about how they might build housing in the middle of parking lots. So, we need to see incredible flexibility from cities on zoning for these things to happen, but there's an incredible pent-up wave of innovation about to happen. And we've also seen dark stores, and this gets back to the notion of, small businesses forced into a corner by various, whipsawing quarantines and lockdowns and closures have now all been had to basically create their own hybrid business models, right? We've seen almost every restaurant is now having to become a retail front, selling wine out of the store, having a brisk pickup and takeout business and doing deliveries either on one of the big platforms like DoorDash or developing their own or investing in that software and basically having to pursue multiple overlapping business models. Now, what bothers me as an urbanist is that a lot of this activity, of course, is not being done by small businesses. We're seeing a huge culling of small businesses across the United States, as a lot of that power has ended up in the hands of Amazon. Here you can see one of their dark stores in Los Angeles, where they've taken Whole Foods and converted them literally into urban warehouses to do the kinds of same-hour deliveries there. This, of course, can be quite lucrative from a real estate perspective and business model, but I worry that too much economic power concentrated in too few hands ultimately has a dulling effect in our cities. And rather than thinking about Amazon, turning its stores, actual stores that we can go into warehouses, I want to come back to and think about as a vision. I'll leave you with this as an image of what could be done. Is something that Walmart presented at the International Council on Shopping Centers a few years ago, and then seems to have abandoned, which was to start thinking about how its stores, after so many years of devastating American downtowns, could become the centers of new community hubs, and thinking about how they would be the places where people would come together. And that's what I think about with all these stores and all these types is how do we convert big box stores and others into these new mixed use realities. And so I guess on that note, I'll leave you with this, and happy to take your questions here. But how do we think ahead? How do we push forward as innovators and work with cities as our partners here to allow this kind of invention to occur, to allow these new formulas that will allow us and a new generation of entrepreneurs to basically rebuild our cities and reinvigorate them on the other side of the pandemic? And with that, thank you so much. I'll be happy to take your questions.
Great. Greg, thank you. So Sandy is here with a microphone, which she's going to hold on to. If anybody has a question, please raise your hand. We're going to have time for just a couple of questions since we're running a little bit long. But Greg, I do have a question for you here about cities and suburbs, and especially here in the suburban-driven Atlanta. We see our developers, including folks in this room and Paul Corley and folks that have very robust sales inside the city still. This year has been one of their best years ever. But where would you place your bet between the city and the suburbs? And are people really going to flee to the suburbs in the face of COVID?
Yeah, I mean, that is the question, right? And I come back to the notion that if I had to place a bet somewhere, it would be actually on the interface between the two. And this goes back to some work that I did, the Millennial Report I mentioned, where I was digging up various studies and looking at sort of where the most innovative firms are going and where millennials are going. And my hypothesis is that those not so young people anymore, but are going to be the largest cohort in America. We're going to drive home sales and of course businesses following the rooftops. Is that they would try to have it all by going to the places in the suburban frontier where they could basically upzone it, right? Where they could sort of see those urban amenities. And the problem with America is not that people love these places is that we don't have enough of them, right? If you look at a graphic of all sort of the housing starts in most major metros in the United States, and this is some work done by Issy Romam, who was at Zillow as their chief economist, you can see that, housing starts in the States are concentrated, multifamily and dense cores, and then new housing starts at the exurban periphery, and there's almost nothing in between, right? I think it's a combination of NIMBYs who don't want building there, or it's of course economically depressed neighborhoods as well. And if we can unlock those energies, if we can basically build new nodes, in that interface between the urban core and the suburban periphery, I think those are going to be some of the richest sites. And just to wrap that question up, Emil Malizia, who's a professor at the University of North Carolina, he actually took data, the Inc. 5000, the 5,000 fastest growing firms in the United States, and charted out where they went. And as it turns out, they want what they called, vitality, right? They wanted to have this mix of amenities. Atlanta was one of his focus cities. It didn't matter to those companies whether they were in downtown Atlanta or Midtown or at Buckhead or elsewhere. They were following those amenities. And so you could see them heading out into the suburbs on various spines, following the highways and whatnot. So I think if we can, densify those nodes, I think that's the place where we'll build. We can't all build in the core of Atlanta or the core of our cities, but we can make those new places for millennials if we choose to invest there.
Great, thank you.
So find that fringe.
Anything from the audience here? Any questions? I got one right here.
What do you think about the great existing and growing development of office suite spaces?
Michael, would you please repeat that?
Yeah, he says, I'm sorry, I did need to repeat that. What do you think about the growing trend with office suite spaces?
Well, I mean, the sense of office suites, how? What you mean at homes or in the sort of shared workspace phenomenon?
Shared workspace with maybe a secretary and then an area for meetings.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I think I think that trend is poised to boom, like I said there too, and and it's going to be interesting to see the locales they're going into. I was obviously WeWork is. The sad irony about WeWork is if WeWork started today or had that kind of money today, they'd be going gangbusters. Instead, they're going to be dealing with the fallout of Adam Newman's disastrous leadership for a long time. But the companies that are following in its wake that have really smart leaders there, I think of like Industrious and some others. I mean, they're investing in places where people are choosing to do other activities. I mean, the new workspaces that I'm seeing go in are going in places like the Dallas Farmers Market is one of their new locations. I think there's a really rich opportunity here to basically figure out like how to co-locate work with where people already naturally want to be, and that's that's not obviously a new formula, but it's going to be interesting. I think I think we're going to see the suburban office district, for example, just surrounded by a sea of parking, are going to suffer a lot worse than we're going to see offices and CBDs, which I think more people are focused on. So yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see the race to like hybridize those as fast as you can and sort of add new formulas onto them, whether that's perks like gyms and things that people were doing before, but I think just more like the ability to go to an office and be able to do all of your errands in a 15-minute city, perhaps around that remote workspace in a new development. Maybe that's the model that's going to happen for Metro Atlanta and for a lot of the American Sunbelt.
So I have one final question for you, Greg. I remember meeting you years back when your book first came out and you were here giving a lecture in Atlanta about Aerotropolis. And I was one that was like, what is that? What in the heck is he talking about? The airport's there and all this stuff is happening, and had no idea what the potential was there. So I have two parts. How are we doing with our Aerotropolis, and what do you see the future of Aerotropolis cities around the world post-pandemic?
Yeah, I would say it's a pleasure to be speaking today. Seeing Aerotropolis Atlanta as one of the sponsors. I mean, my book came out a decade ago in February, so it's been a while. And I'd like to joke that I wrote a book about cities, globalization, and air travel. And conventional wisdom says all three aren't doing so hot right now. So but I guess I'm a contrarian that way. So yeah, it's been great to see obviously the development of Atlantis, and I think the focus there on sort of addressing the lack of growth on the south side of Atlanta for all these years is really a profound thing. I am glad to see again thinking about pushing beyond just like a glass building surrounded by a sea of parking. So it's great, and it's great to see the kind of of alliances of government and sort of public-private partnerships around to create that. That was one of the big insights I had of that book in talking to folks in cities around the United States, is that that basically our sort of economic growth engines and our governance models in the States have been disconnected. And so groups like Aerotropolis Atlanta, you guys are trying to put that back together again and think about how we can maximize that asset, which of course is why Atlanta is a global city. So yeah, to your second point though, about the long-term prognosis, I mean, obviously, it's very interesting to see how bleak things will be for the global aviation industry. I do think, I think a couple of things there. One of which is that, aviation is going to be more important than ever for the United States, for us to replug back into the global economy. I'm speaking at a conference in China in April. Their domestic airline industry, it's as if nothing ever happened there. We're seeing growth in Asia resume in the places where, they don't have these debates about whether cities will come back. Life continues as normal in Seoul and Tokyo and so forth. So we've got to get back into that game, and we've got to basically reinvest in aviation. And so therefore, cities like Atlanta plugged into those global networks in a much shrunken aviation system, headquarters to Delta. Obviously, I think that's going to be critical. And so, perhaps while this has been a terrible thing in the aggregate for America, perhaps this could ultimately be good for Atlanta, because if you have to choose to focus your energies, you're going to choose to focus on America's major hubs there. So I look forward to seeing what you guys come up with there to, continue to attract global companies like Porsche into that footprint.
Well, they're doing a great job down there. We just had a big meeting down at Porsche a few weeks back, and the area is looking great. Well, Greg, thank you very much. We appreciate you being with us today.
Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you so much, everyone.
And hey, as to Jeopardy, we're all sorry to see Alex Trebek no longer with us. I hope to see you as a guest host. I hope they've called you for one of those guest host roles soon.
I would love nothing more there. I was to say, I wish I could have gotten some of my discussions of AI, because seeing the IBM team up close too is fascinating. But yeah, it was tragic to see Alex pass.
Well, thank you again. So listen, guys, I want to thank our board, our sponsors, our membership, everybody who's with us today. We appreciate your support this year. It's been a great year. It's been a great 35 years for the council. I've been here, goodness, 17 of those years, and I appreciate the support that you've given me, given our staff, and everyone who's been a part of the council all these years.